Yvonne is in Australia, so I've been delegated to be moderator today. Hopefully it's 4 o'clock in the morning, but he said he might join us anyway. We'll see. I'll get us going, even though people are still joining and do the introduction, but we like to get things stay on schedule here. So we're happy today to welcome Chris Brunet. Chris is an independent journalist and also a contributing editor at the American Conservative. He's an active participant in the Econ Job Rumors website, where economists discuss many issues anonymously. And as you can imagine, with any anonymous website, it has its share of salacious content, which gets it in trouble sometimes, or some people don't like it. But it also carries a lot of breaking news of interest in the economics profession. And in particular, many posters on EJMR have revealed cases of papers that, how shall I put this politely, failed to replicate well. And that's what an anonymous website is useful for, because it's hard to bring charges that somebody's screwing with their data. Chris has taken a lot of this stuff and turned them into Substack articles and other written things, revealing cases of papers that don't replicate well, of great interest to the economics profession. It's also, I will admit to visiting EJMR, it's a place where you can find out how people truly feel about a lot of issues that aren't often discussed out loud in public and academia. And as you can imagine, EJMR has been the focus of many efforts to shut it down over the years, to construct sanitized alternatives, all of which have interestingly bombed. So why are we here today? We're here in the aftermath of a paper by Florian Ederer, who's at Boston University, with Paul Goldsmith-Pinkham and Kyle Jensen from Yale. The authors of this paper figured out how to identify the supposedly anonymous IP addresses on EJMR, and they wrote a paper with the results of their unmasking, which they presented at the NBR Summer Institute. Now, as you can imagine, anonymous postings these days lead to cancellations, social ostracism, and put PhD applicants, job candidates, and assistant professors in real fear for their careers. So that was a pretty explosive step, and raising important issues of privacy, legality, university policies, and so forth. So we originally invited Florian to come talk to us about his paper, and we invited Chris to discuss it. Florian accepted, but then when he heard Chris would be the discussant, he pulled out. But we still have Chris to tell us the story. So Chris, take it away.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. There we go. So thank you very much. It's good to be here today because I'm actually a failed economist. I was rejected from every economics PhD program that I applied to. So why am I here today at Stanford, speaking to a group of academics about the state of free speech in the academic economics profession, a profession that would not even let me join their club. Well, it's precisely because I'm not in that club, because that I have to be the one to tell the story today, because I don't have anything to lose. I have nothing, I have no publications or tenure or promotions that can be hung over my head, so I have the luxury of speaking the truth. And I've used this failure in my economics career as motivation over the past few years to grow a large Substack following. Yeah. Yeah, so for context, Richard Hanania, who was here a couple of weeks ago, or who was supposed to be, I'm about 1/3 as big as Richard Hanania on Substack. So I leveraged that Substack to get a job at the American Conservative, which is the best conservative media outlet in America, in my opinion. So I'm not an economist like I thought I was going to be. I'm a journalist slash writer. And in that capacity as a storyteller, I've written 11 articles so far about today's scandal, tracking it from the beginning. So that's also why I'm best suited to cover this story. I know the details better than anyone else in the world, pretty much. And the reason why I've written so many stories, like I've written these 11 stories here on the slide, which are all hyperlinked on the slide, I'll share the slide, is that it's not an exaggeration to say that this might yet turn out to be the biggest economic scandal of like the past year or the past decade even. And when I say economics, of course, I'm not talking about economics, strictly speaking. I'm not talking about macroeconomics or microeconomics or finance or game theory. I'm talking about economists. Um, I'm talking about economists fighting with other economists over personal grievances, kind of like vindictive little high school children competing to be class president. That's frankly how I see it, and it's frankly embarrassing that I have to be the one today talking. Like you already said, Florian pulled out, but here we are. Today's story revolves around the website econjobrumors.com. And I encourage anyone listening to this right now to Google EGMR and check it out for yourselves. Most of you are probably already familiar with it, but the way I describe it in short is that it's like 4chan for economists. So it's an anonymous message board where economists can go to let their hair down and talk about research, hiring, their students, their wives, their husbands, their kids, politics, whatever. It's pretty simple. It's just an anonymous forum for economists. And I should mention today that many of the ideas that I speak about today come directly from that website. So full credit to them for many of the ideas today. The primary benefit of Econ Job Rumors isn't just a vent, it's to air dirty laundry in the economics profession, which is why elite left-wing economists, generally speaking, hate it so much. This story that I'm about to tell is really a divide not only between classical liberals who believe in free speech on one hand, but also between it's a divide between classical liberals who like free speech and left-wing fascists, pretty much. And put simply, these leftist economists want a monopoly over information in the profession, just like they want a monopoly over information in society and in the media more broadly. So by allowing economists all over the world to speak their mind anonymously, EGMR decentralizes that information, thus reducing the problem of information asymmetry on the profession and in the profession and on the job market. So this information on EGMR, like these 12 scandals, these are just 12 examples. This is information that used to only be whispered in powerful hallways by powerful people. And those gatekeepers really, really don't like when anyone is allowed to whisper whatever they want. And so these whispers on EGMR have resulted in dozens of scandals being broken over the past few years, exposing dozens and dozens of students and professors as plagiarists, p-hackers, data manipulators, frauds, bullies, and if you're going to look at just one of these threads, I suggest number one on the list at the very top left corner, which is a thread called New Family Ruptures, AER NB NBER is a ripoff of obscure paper, which is commonly known on EGMR as just the family rupture scandal. The family rupture scandal is one of the most famous examples of scientific malfeasance that EGMR has ever exposed. So if you go check out that thread yourself, there's about 6,000 comments on it, all about this one scandal, which is a good example of the scandal that EGMR has exposed. And this family rupture scandal is actually about two Stanford University professors, Maya Rosenslatter, an associate professor at the Stanford Department of Health Policy, and Petra Person, an assistant professor at the Stanford Economics Department. They were caught when an anonymous post on the website pointed out that they ripped off a paper from another discipline and passed it off as their own. So upon being caught, they colluded with an editor to sweep the ripoff under the rug. Like it was a whole big scandal, but it was a few years ago. Um, and upon being caught in the scandal, these authors took no accountability and instead played the gender card, going on the offensive and tweeting repeatedly that there should be, quote, penalties for engaging on EGMR, and quote, economics will never achieve inclusivity and diversity if EGMR continues to exist. In other words, they want the harshest censorship possible. They want EGMR to cease to exist, and they want you to believe that this censorship is justified because EGMR is sexist or toxic or anti-diversity or whatever. So yeah, that scandal is a few years old at this point. It's old news. But the reason I'm bringing up is that I'm attempting to establish a pattern. This is a common theme that you'll see in today's story, where EGMR catches someone committing fraud, and then that person launches a vindictive campaign to have EGMR deplatformed or demonetized or otherwise censored from the internet. And this censorship is always in the name of diversity. So let's talk about diversity. EGMR is significantly more diverse than the economics profession in terms of gender. As per Google Analytics from 2023, EGMR is 35% female compared to 22% of the American economists who are female and 19% of Econ Twitter who is female. So women are roughly twice as represented on EGMR as they are in your faculty lounge or on Econ Twitter. But Maya Rawson-Slatter wants you to think that economics will never achieve inclusivity and diversity if EGMR continues to exist.
Can I ask,
I reached out
how
to,
do we know,
yeah, go ahead.
how do we know the gender of people on EGMR?
Google and these Google Analytics were provided by the owner of EGMR to me. I emailed them and I requested. So I reached out to Dr. Rawson-Slatter and I asked her to kind of square this circle for me. I said, um, why are so many women posting on the website that is supposedly so anti-women? And she said, quote, in order to reconcile this diversity puzzle, I would need statistics on the share of women posting with misogynistic and sexually harassing language. Until I have that information, I cannot answer. Okay. And she also said about the scandal to me, do I have a vendetta against the EGMR as a result of this experience? I don't know. I guess it depends on how you define vendetta. Other than a few tweets and signing some petitions, I can't say that I've done very much to deplatform EGMR. I certainly have not been very effective at it. It's very much still around. And so she also said that if I used her quote about economics will never achieve inclusivity if EGMR continues to exist, that I show the full context. So there's the full context. And she also added a clarification to that statement. Which brings me to the actual scandal that I'm here to talk about today, which revolves around three Yale professors, Paul Goldsmith-Pinkham, who is a PhD from Harvard, Kyle Jensen, who is a PhD from MIT, and Florian Ederer, who also has a PhD from MIT. Well, Florian is technically not a Yale professor anymore. He just failed tenure there and moved to Boston. But when I talk about it today, I'm going to talk about three Yale professors because he worked at Yale when he wrote and presented this paper. So these three Yale professors wrote a paper, which we'll talk about, bragging about how they hacked EGMR and illegally stole millions of IP addresses tied to millions of anonymous posts. If you posted on EGMR thinking you were anonymous, your anonymity has now been compromised, and these three Yale professors own your data. We'll get into the details of the hack, but first I'd like to discuss Paul Goldsmith-Pinkham's motivations. Last year, EGMR caught him plagiarizing a paper from a group of low-ranked economists. So just like there was a thread for that family rupture scandal, you can read all about this scandal. The title of the thread is on the slide there. And the thread is titled Forthcoming Journal of Finance by Yale Professor is a ripoff of low-ranked paper. And make up your own mind about the plagiarism or the alleged plagiarism, but it's pretty straightforward. EGMR exposed him as a plagiarist last year, and then a few months later, he hacked the website and claiming that he's doing this hack in the name of science and diversity, but that's a lie. He doesn't care about diversity. He's weaponizing diversity for personal revenge. That's my theory, at least. And I think it makes a lot of sense. So how did these three Yale professors actually pull off the hack? In cybersecurity terms, it involves cracking what is called an unsalted hash. But I'm going to keep things simple. I'm not going to delve into the technical details. Essentially, what cracking an unsalted hash means is that the anonymous owner of EGMR left a cybersecurity flaw open on the website. And these Yale authors exploited that vulnerability via brute force hacking. The analogy I use to describe this brute force hack is with a bike lock. So imagine you were walking down the street one day and you saw a bike lock protecting a bike, and you tried out 9 quadrillion combinations. That's how many combinations they tried out to get everyone's IP addresses on that bike lock using thousands of hours of compute time, costing thousands and thousands of dollars of university resources until you eventually cracked it and rode away with that bike. Except they didn't steal a bike, obviously. They stole extremely confidential and sensitive data, which is much, much more serious. And then they smiled and they claimed that the brute force hacking of the bike lock was okay because the bike lock was sitting out in public that the byte block was not perfectly uncrackable, so it was okay to crack it. And anyways, the byte block was the combination of the byte block was public information.
Can
Sorry,
you
but no,
comment?
that sorry, go ahead.
Can you comment a little bit? So exactly what did they find? They found the IP address of the individual users, and from there can recover the name of the individual posters, or and how many of the people were affected that were on EGMR?
So that's something I'll get into later, is like what they can do to weaponize the IP data. Which is there is actually a way to link that directly to individual names, so that they can find out exactly who posted some of the posts. And you know what? I'm gonna get to that soon. So I'm just like that's in a couple of slides from now. Okay, yeah. So they
Just one
claim
point of
that it's not a
clarification.
hack.
One point of quick clarification.
Go
Did
ahead.
they get human subjects approval?
For months, nobody knew if they had human subject approval. They did not talk about it, and so people were complaining about human subject approval for months. And then just yesterday, they updated their paper and the new updated version of the paper claims that they have approval from Yale's Institutional Review Board. And we'll talk about the Yale's Institutional Review Board as well. Like that's also in a few slides from now. Oh yeah, so go read their paper if you want to know how they crack their hash. But they brute force hacked the website. So these Yale hackers style themselves as ethical white hat hackers, doing the Lord's work by bringing evil Nazis and evil bigots to heel and making the world a better place by exposing cybersecurity flaws via adversarial hardening, thus making the internet more secure for everyone in the long run. But that's not really how hacking works. That's not how being a white hat hacker works. You simply cannot weaponize research or hacking in this way. The excuse that the research was weaponized against bad people, so it makes it okay, just doesn't really hold up. For example, who is the arbiter of good and evil? Who gets to decide who's evil enough to deserve to be hacked and who's too good and pure and virtuous to be allowed to be hacked? So if I think that these three Yale professors are fascists, for example, would I be justified in writing an academic paper where I hacked into their emails, even if I discovered a publicly accessible flaw in Gmail? And then I run a bunch of text mining algorithms on their personal emails, and I share their personal emails with everybody. I think it's pretty clear that I would not be allowed to do that, even if I thought it was justified, and even if the flaw was publicly accessible. So no, they're not white hat hackers, because the very first rule of being a white hat hacker, if you Google like white hat hacking ethics, is that when you identify a security flaw on a website, you're supposed to notify the site owner to give that owner a chance to protect people's identity and privacy. The very last thing you're supposed to do upon identifying a flaw is to exploit that flaw to steal all the website's confidential data. A black hat hacker, which is what this is someone who violates laws or typical ethical standards for nefarious reasons, such as cyber warfare, cybercrime, or malice, such as the malice that Paul Goldsmith Pinkham holds on to for having his plagiarism exposed in front of the whole world on this website. The owner of EGMR, who is anonymous, he agrees that this was a hack. According to an interview he gave to Inside Higher Ed a few months ago, he said, quote, "You may wish to consider what a neutral actor, ChatGPT, thinks about the study. Would reverse engineering partial hash codes of thousands of website users to get their IPs with brute force be considered hacking?" ChatGPT replied, "Yes, that activity would certainly be considered hacking, and specifically, it would be illegal and unethical." Dr. Tyler Cowen, an economics professor at George Mason University, who everyone here has heard of, also agrees it was a hack. He wrote 2 blog posts concluding, "So, and I do not say this lightly, I believe the authors of the paper under consideration are behaving unethically, and I hope they will retract their work and then destroy it." The Yale authors' defense of the hack is repeated numerous times in their papers and tweets and public statements. They say, quote, "All of this is achieved using only publicly available data," end quote. "There's been a lot of speculation about how we geolocated millions of EGMR posts. The truth is rather mundane. It's just some public data and some math. I would like to counter this, it's just public data and some math justification by using an example of the hacker group known as Goatsy Security, who exposed a flaw in AT&T security in 2010 using the exact same using the same methodology, which allowed the email addresses of millions of iPad users to be revealed. That flaw was part of a publicly accessible URL, which allowed the hacker to collect millions of emails that were supposed to be confidential as per AT&T's terms of service, just like EGMR has terms of service that says the IPs were supposed to be kept confidential. And so the FBI opened an investigation into that hack, the AT&T hack, in 2011 under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and charged the AT&T hacker for one count of conspiracy to access a computer without authorization and one count of fraud. That hacker was found guilty and sentenced to 41 months in federal prison. And before his sentencing hearing, he told reporters, quote, "I'm going to jail for just doing arithmetic." So the question is, why are the 3 Yale professors not serving 41 months in federal prison right now? The reason is that there are 2 sets of laws in Joe Biden's America, and the law does not apply to useful left-wing activists equally. Let's put it this way. Does anyone here have any doubt that if a group of right-wing academics hacked a left-wing forum, that those right-wing academics would have the book thrown at them? Or another example would people be happy if a religious institution, say a priest, a rabbi, or an imam, found a way to scrape, identify, and share everyone's personal information from a gay or lesbian dating website using the justification that their gay behavior is toxic, or that I calculated that X% of the data on the website is toxic? Would that be considered acceptable research, even if they wrote a research paper about the gay dating hack? If you cheer on and try to normalize this unethical research about EGMR, then you have to be prepared for the consequences of the flip side. You have to have principles. You cannot just operate purely based on power. While working on this story, this is the best example of how individual people can be identified from the IP addresses. While working on the story, I discovered that in addition to hacking EGMR, Paul Goldsmith-Pinkham also owns the Econ Twitter Mastodon server, which is where left-wing economists fled when Elon Musk bought Twitter. Paul Goldsmith-Pinkham paid to operate that Mastodon server straight from his Yale research funds, which effectively makes any economist who posted on Mastodon under their real name his and Yale's research subjects. And so he owns the IP address of any economist who's ever posted on Mastodon, and he owns the IP address of anyone who's ever posted on EGMR. So with about 2 simple lines of data, two simple lines of code, he can link that and link you directly to your real name without any need to guess. I wrote an article about this, which is on the screen right there. And 2 months after I wrote that first article, he shut down the Mastodon server permanently, saying, quote, "I can no longer justify the costs of operating that server." Remember, he was paying for that server straight from his Yale research budget, so it makes it odd that he can no longer justify those costs. I can only conclude that the Mastodon server was a research experiment funded by Yale University. It's not just Mastodon users, though, at risk. It's anyone who's ever used EGMR. One of the most vulnerable groups.
Chris, can I just mention something
go ahead.
quickly, David Henderson? I'm really loving this talk, stuff I didn't know. I don't think you should use the term "he owns it." When you steal something, you don't own it. So.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, well, I don't know the exact term to use, but that makes sense.
He claims to own it. How's that?
Correct.
But this is something I hope you'll go into. First of all, what they did with it in the paper is interesting, but this also means they have on their computers the full list of IP addresses. And if you publish this paper, then that has to be, first of all, he can give it to anyone he wants to, whether he owns it or not. But if you publish a paper, then these days you have to reveal all your data. So in some sense, the full list of IP addresses for EGMR has to be public, correct?
Well, I believe in the new draft of the paper, he says they will not release that data. But we'll also get to this. They've also publicly hinted like several times that they'll share it through back channels with their friends. And there's proof of that. So it's not just Mastodon users at risk of the hack, it's anyone who's used EGMR. But one of the most vulnerable groups is dissidents from authoritarian regimes. After the hack was done, for example, EGMR was flooded with posts by Chinese dissidents worried that what they had posted about Xi Jinping would find its way back to the CCP, meaning their families would, or they or their families could face prison, torture, death. Like, it's really serious. It's really not a joke. Or, for example, Turkish dissidents worried about similar retribution from Erdogan. In the wake of the hack, one commenter wrote, quote, "I post from Erdogan's Turkey and I count myself dead already." This is especially bad because now that it's trivial for those regimes to reverse engineer the hack because the code and the data is already floating out there. Even though the security flaw has since been patched, if Jennifer Doliak can find the old data, you better believe the Chinese government can find the old data as well. Like, here she is bragging about it. And even in addition to that, it's even worse because they produced a series of 3 instructional YouTube videos walking viewers through how to replicate the docs themselves and how to reverse engineer all the IP addresses. So they really want their doxing method to be widely used. They want it to be replicated, and they don't really care who has the IP addresses. Like, they want this to be replicated. Why else would you make a series of instructional YouTube videos explaining it to a 5-year-old to how to reverse engineer everyone on EGMR's IP address? So it's not just Mastodon users, not just gay people, not just dissidents who are at risk from this hack. It's also mentally fragile individuals prone to anxiety, depression, or suicide. Many of them turn to EGMR for solace in tough times, under the impression that they're pouring their heart out and venting anonymously. By hacking EGMR, Yale University can now see what those suicidal, depressed, and anxious individuals wrote in their darkest moments, which is a massive violation of trust. One such economist was brave enough to speak about this to me, or under his real name. And I believe it's important, so I'm going to read part of the statement. "I'm Matt Wimble. I discussed suicide on EGMR. I was included in the study without my approval or knowledge, and Florian Ederer, the American Economic Association, the National Bureau of Economic Research, Yale's Institutional Review Board, and Yale, and all signatories have refused to provide me the human subjects paperwork which I asked for weeks ago. This triggered an episode which landed me in the hospital and broke up my family. I'm an Eagle Scout and a good guy. You people on EGMR, in your weird way, helped me to recover from a tenured denial and subsequent suicide attempt. I count 5 violations of the Nuremberg Code in their exempt study. I stand up for suicidal people. My economics PhD is from Michigan State. Sue me. I should be out of the hospital soon and needed healing. Zero responses from the authors when I tried to contact them. I'm moving back to Michigan to be with my family, hopefully save my 17-year-old marriage and heal my 8-year-old daughter who has a tremor now. I'm nice use of my tax dollars. I bet a few of the authors have national security clearances as well. This is bad." So why did Yale and the authors not respond to Matt Wimble when he, a human subject of the study, which I think is not really in doubt, asked them for human subjects paperwork? They totally failed in their job to protect human subjects, and as such, I believe Yale is now open to significant legal risk. What if this doxing campaign, what if this data and these IP addresses and this whole doxing campaign pushes yet another mentally fragile person to end up in the hospital or worse? If harm comes to someone else and it turns out it could have been prevented by Yale's Institutional Review Board, the blood will be on Yale University's hands. So as I don't really have to talk about this, I was going to talk about how Florian Ederer was supposed to be here today, but we've already talked about that. Yeah, I mean, like, if you're an economics professor from Yale with a PhD from MIT who wrote a paper that you're proud of, you should have no problem whatsoever defending your paper against a journalist or a blogger. And the fact that he refused to show up today speaks volumes. although I'm sure he's watching on YouTube right now. Florian, I am happy to debate you about EGMR and the state of free speech any place, anytime. So let's talk about the paper, or we're getting to the part now where we're going to talk about the paper. Rather than circulate it for feedback like an honest scholar would, the authors hyped it up for 2 months, 2 whole months, before presenting it at the National Bureau of Economic Research Summer Institute, which I'm led to believe is the most elite economics conference of the year. Because they made such a big deal hyping it up on Twitter for months, like very cryptically hyping it up, a lot of people suffered in the meantime because they thought they were going to be, they didn't know what would happen. They were suffering mentally. It was a huge spectacle, and I could show you all the crazy tweets of like hundreds of economics professors begging for their political enemies to be revealed and fired. But probably the craziest examples on the slide here was Jake Victor, who is a professor of public policy at the University of Washington. He wrote a proposal that all newly hired professors must subject all anonymous posts they've ever made on any website subject to review from the university. And failure to disclose all your anonymous posts ever may be ground for termination for any hired candidate. And he went through the trouble of formally writing this proposal down. He wants the end of anonymity, and sorry, but no more criticizing the Chinese or the Turkish governments anymore online because Jake Victor doesn't want you to. Or if you do, you better be prepared to face the consequences. It's further worth noting that this is not even really an economics paper. It's really an undergrad level cybersecurity paper mixed with gossip. Showcasing research like this at the National Bureau of Economic Research is a slap in the face to the economics profession because it dilutes the scope of actual economics research, and it gives an incorrect perception to the public about what economists do and questions economists try to answer. It signals that the National Bureau of Economic Research, rather than disseminating high potential economic research, which is what they should be doing, is choosing participants for reasons based on factors other than merit, relevance, or potential. This paper took up a valuable slot at that conference that could have been used more appropriately. So after hyping it up for months, when the day of the presentation finally came, the very first thing the presenter at the Summer Institute did before even discussing the content of the paper was to give a shout out to the New York Times reporter in the room, announcing to the world that the New York Times had traveled there specifically to write an article about this hacking paper. And then, after the presentation, the New York Times did not even bother to write any article. Incredibly, the paper was too unethical and or flawed for even the New York Times to report on, even though they must have desperately wanted to cry about diversity in economics. As one EGMR commenter put it, quote, "The New York Times shout out by the host was an all-time great self-own, but it's probably actually good for the authors because a New York Times article would only have led to more people who would ask, wait, is this research not both illegal and unethical?" And on that note, I would like to give a special shout out to the 2 Bloomberg reporters in the audience today. After the botched New York Times shout out, the Yale authors walked through how they cracked the unsalted hash, and then they presented some cute summary statistics about the IP addresses, like who posts on EGMR, what time of day, from what countries, etc. Based on this analysis, they conclude that, quote, "Posting on EGMR is pervasive and very common in academia because over 10% of posts originate from universities, including all top-ranked universities in the United States." Except for the fact that even in those 10% of posts, they can't distinguish between students or faculty or staff or anyone really, and let alone the other 90% of posts coming from mostly random residential IP addresses all around the world. Which could be from anyone. And I know from experience that economists do post on EGMR, but there's also like a ton of random, like scientists, engineers, mathematicians, lawyers, software developers, undergrads, Chinese dissidents, Turkish dissidents, suicidal people, gay teenagers, bodybuilders, basement dwellers, and grocery store clerks. Anyone can post there. And it's widely believed, although we can't really prove it, that the most toxic people are basement dwellers, not economists. So after this stuff, so after the summary statistics, though, comes the real meat of the paper, which we're going to get into now, which is measuring toxicity. The word toxic appears
So
in their
could I
paper
ask a quick-
88 times.
Could I ask a quick
Yeah,
question?
of course.
What was the name of the New York Times reporter? Do you remember?
I don't know. I wasn't
Okay.
there.
Okay, thanks.
Anyone who was in the room should be able to, like, I don't know. Okay, so the term toxic appears in their paper 88 times, despite the fact that the term toxic is really not a scientific word. It's a nebulous term intended to evoke emotions and scorn in the reader. And people who support this paper have weaponized this word toxic to control the public discourse and to slander any views they don't agree with. Just like they do with the terms hate speech or misinformation or disinformation. It's all kind of very nebulous and like it means whatever they want it to mean. And I really, really, really don't like this word toxic, especially in a scientific context, which this paper purports to be. A clash of ideas, when ideas clash, is not inherently toxic. Just like the clash of fists in a boxing ring is not toxicity. One might liken EGMR to a digital boxing ring, just like Twitter is like a digital boxing ring, where all ideas should be let out and then the best ideas win, right? So when views clash on EGMR or on Twitter, this clashing is not inherently bad or toxic. In fact, science requires that views that are wrong to be dismantled and trashed, sometimes even if that trashing is in a rude way. So the word toxic is inherently partisan and unscientific, but let's assume for a minute that it's actually a reasonable thing to quantify. How do the authors quantify toxic in their paper? The answer on the screen there is that they web scraped the website and then ran a machine learning algorithm on that web scrape data. And that machine algorithm classified every single post as binary, either toxic or not toxic. And the exact algorithm on the screen there is called, it's an off-the-shelf Python package called Toxygen Roberta. And the authors of this Toxygen Python package, the way they built it is that they told a text generator to generate over 274,000 toxic and benign sentences about these three minority groups. So it's all about machine generated statements about these 13 minority groups. That's how the algorithm was built. And after they generated these 274,000 statements about these groups, they paid 156 workers on Mechanical Turk to annotate just how toxic they believed those machine-generated statements to be. And it's worth noting at this point that they ran a survey on those 156 Mechanical Turk workers, and for every one worker that identified as right-leaning or very right-leaning, 2.3 workers identified as left-leaning or very left-leaning. So the Toxygen algorithm has that left-wing human bias built into it. And this is what the human bias looks like. With just one line of code, you can see here, like it's easy to run, like it's one line of code, Toxygen Roberta in Python. And you can see how the algorithm labels everything as either label 1, toxic, label 0, not toxic. So for an example of the left-wing algorithm, the phrase, there are only two genders is toxic. The phrase, men cannot become women, toxic. The phrase, children should be given puberty blockers, chud, not toxic. My point is that it's a very biased, very left-wing algorithm, and in general, we'll get more into the misclassification problem that's happening. But so much of this misclassification is either just totally random or extremely biased. And my point is you cannot trust this algorithm. There's some more examples on that screen there. Like, for example, turn Israel into a parking lot, to use a topical example, is toxic, but sweep Israel into the sea, not toxic. Israel is rightful Jewish land, toxic. Israel is rightful Muslim land, not toxic, right? So now let's play along and let's assume that 10% of posts on EGMR are toxic, which is what the Yale paper found. 10% of posts are toxic as per that algorithm. Is that good? Is that bad? Compared to what? Well, the Yale team conveniently never bothered to ask that question. Toxic compared to what? I guess they never bothered to study Thomas Sowell, who works at the Stanford Hoover Institution or Institute, I forget, who famously said that most ideas on the left crumble when asked three questions. Compared to what, at what cost, what hard evidence do you have? According to Thomas Sowell, there are very few ideas on the left that can pass all three questions. So what I did is I replicated the Yale team's results. I web scraped EJMR myself, and I asked the question, EJMR is toxic compared to what? And we'll get to the results soon, but before I get into my compared to what results, oh yeah, I showed these results to Econ Journal Watch, the journal, and they have encouraged me to submit a complete manuscript to them. So be on the lookout for that manuscript within the next few months. And I'm eventually going to run my code. I ran my code that I'm about to show you on a slice of data, right? Because it takes weeks for me to run the entire code, but so far I've ran it on what you're about to see is 100,000 tweets, 40,000 Reddit posts, 20,000 EJMR posts, 20,000 PSR posts, where PSR is polyscirumors.com, which is the sister site of EJMR, but for political scientists, which is also another weird thing. Like, it's a very, very obvious comparison to make. There's two sets of data for economists and political scientists in the exact same format right next to each other. And the Yale team did not want to compare them for some reason. Obviously, the reason is that they wanted to make economists look as toxic as possible. So yeah, I ran my code on.
Chris, I
Yeah,
want
go ahead.
just to say you have a habit of assailing people's motivations, which I would encourage you not to do. Let's stick to the facts if possible.
Sure.
But go
I cannot disagree with you. So I ran my code on, let's say I ran my code on 30,000 posts. I don't think it's going to change very much when I run it on 3 million posts. Like the results are very stable, I think. And like yeah, we'll show you the results. So first I web scraped EJMR, and the way I web scraped it is that I emailed the website and he set up an API for me. So I just had to query the API with like these lines of Python code. And you can see it does it 50,000 posts at a time. And you cannot replicate the web scraping and yet. And the reason is because there's a password there. See in the very first line of code, there's password XXX. There's a password to the API. So just so the API doesn't get overwhelmed, there's a temporary password on it. And this is what the EJMR data looks like. Or this is one example. So when I run the API, I get the raw data on the left, which includes the tons of like HTML and importantly block quotes, which are just like posts that quote other posts. So I cleaned out the data and that's what it looks like on the right. And there's a column in the data, which is available at that link. And it's called clean text. And what I did is I ran the Toxygen algorithm on that clean text data. And it classified every clean text row into either toxic, not toxic. And well, we'll see the results visually, but I'll tell you about the results. So the Yale team concluded that 10% of posts on EJMR were toxic, and I conclude that it was 11%. And the PSR, which is the PoliSci website, 10%. So there's not a big difference between economists and political scientists. And I also ran this code several times on several slices of data. And sometimes when I run it, it'll be 9%, sometimes it'll be 10%, sometimes it'll be 11%, but it's pretty much always around 10%, which is why I don't really expect my results to change when I run it on millions of posts rather than 20,000 posts. Oh, misclassification. So we talked about like the sweep Israel into the sea examples earlier. But that was just me playing around with the like anything I could put into the code. But here are some real examples of the code in my results that these posts here were classified as toxic, even though many of them are just not toxic, in my opinion. And I'm not going to walk through all these posts, but you can really make up your mind for yourself. Like the first one here is toxic, and it just says cats being cute is a way to manipulate humans into meeting their needs. It's all about survival, not cuteness. And here are some posts that the algorithm labeled not toxic, but in my opinion should be labeled toxic. And my point here is that I think the misclassification error speaks for itself. Just with these examples. And I think, again, this is me putting motivations to the authors, but I hypothesize that that's why they haven't made their data public, even though they ran their results on the web scraped EGMR data, and they could have released that data and their algorithm results of binary toxic, not toxic to the world. But maybe a reason why they didn't is because if they did release their data, there'd be like hundreds and hundreds of silly examples of misclassification error going on. And when I write up my manuscript formally for Econ Journal Watch, I'm gonna find a way to rigorously quantify this misclassification. But for now, we're just gonna have to look at examples.
I'm a little bit, why do we care? I mean, we're a bunch of free speechers here. Toxic or non-toxic? I mean, if it's illegal to find your IP address and dox you for what you did anonymously, and it's even more illegal if what you did is what somebody else thinks is toxic.
I agree. You should be allowed to write toxic stuff, and
Yeah.
even if you do write toxic stuff, like I don't believe you should be doxxed and publicly shamed for writing toxic stuff that you wrote anonymously. So why do we care? Is I actually have a slide on that in 2 slides from now.
Okay, I'll wait for
Like
the
I'm going to
slide.
assume that we do care and it's valid and good. What does that mean?
But it is also, this
and
is
we'll get to
supposed
that
to be
soon.
an economics paper, which should be done competently. If these people are incompetent and doing sloppy work, that's also relevant beyond the fact that they're criminals.
Sure. I have nothing to add. Okay, so my
Found
results
yourself
on
sideswiped
EGMR.
on the right by Richard.
So EGMR 11% toxic, my result. PSR 10% toxic, my result. And then I compare these with subreddits. So, or to start, I'd compare them with subreddits. And this is where things start to get interesting. I ran my code, the same code on these 22 subreddits. And you might ask, how did I pick these subreddits? And the answer is on a whim, basically. Like there's some of the biggest ones are there, like r/news and r/politics. I have to find a way to do it rigorously. But another problem is that I couldn't run thousands and thousands of subreddits because I had compute constraints and time constraints. So I really had to pick just 22 subreddits. And this idea to compare EGMR against subreddits actually comes from an anonymous Twitter account who is the first one to compare EGMR toxicity with subreddit toxicity, and he wrote a big thread about it. He posted on EGMR about it. He sent it to the authors. The authors never responded to him. So really, this whole thing is his idea, this Brad F. Twitter account. And this is what the Reddit data looks like. So this is one subreddit. This is r/news, which is one of the biggest subreddits in the world. And this is just to give you an example of what the data looks like. And that's pretty much what my EGMR data looks like as well. Like it's just posts of text. And each one is classified as binary, toxic or non-toxic. And we'll get into the Reddit results soon, but I also ran it on Twitter. Like, so I compared Reddit and Twitter, EGMR, PSR. And again, I couldn't run it on hundreds and hundreds of Econ Twitter accounts, so I picked 50. And this is my subjective list of 50 accounts that represent Econ Twitter. And when I present these results to Econ Journal Watch, I'm going to have to figure out a way to rigorously isolate the Econ Twitter network. And there are ways to do that, and I'm working on doing that. But even if I could find every single Econ Twitter account right now, I didn't have the time to run the code on that many accounts. So I picked 50. You might be able to pick a better 50. In this 50, there's about 40 economics professors. There's some bloggers. There's like some finance people. And then there's me. One more. So in addition to Econ Twitter, I also am going to compare these results to Twitter as a whole. And the way I am going to quantify toxicity on Twitter as a whole is by Twitter's own definition of toxic. So when Elon Musk bought Twitter, he commissioned this independent agency or independent company to run an assessment on Twitter and determine how many tweets are toxic. And their independent assessment, based on their definition of toxic and their algorithm, is that 14.5% of tweets are toxic. And here are what my results look like there. This is comparing Econ Twitter, Twitter, Reddit, EGMR, PSR. So the blue bars there are Econ Twitter. Econ Twitter is the least toxic, or the 50 I chose were. And the subreddits are in red. They're overwhelmingly more toxic than Twitter or EGMR. That pink bar here is Elon Musk, not Elon Musk, Twitter's independent assessment of toxicity. So Twitter says they're 14.5% toxic. So that's there as a benchmark as well. And those two black bars are EGMR and PSR. And it's worth noting that the top 3 most toxic Twitter accounts are myself, Nicholas Taleb, and Nouriel Rubini. And so those are 3 asshole contrarians. So who knows? Maybe the toxicity algorithm is somewhat valid and picking up something after all. I'm willing to entertain them. Let's assume that's true. If you believe that the Yale team's toxicity measure is valid and a good measure of toxicity, you must also now believe that EGMR is overwhelmingly less toxic than Reddit. And anyone with academic integrity who believes that EGMR is a hate site and needs to be demonetized, which people do, they either now need to issue an apology, or they also need to call for Reddit to be demonetized and deplatformed, because Reddit is twice as toxic, and even Twitter is more toxic. So why are these people calling for EGMR? Like, they're targeting advertisers on EGMR. Why are they not targeting advertisers on Reddit? I'm going to keep moving, but if anyone has any questions about this bar chart, I'm happy to take questions. No?
I see now why it matters, because if the point is to run a cancel on EJMR getting to its advertisers, then pointing out by the same measure Twitter is worse that's an effective, important point.
Yep, I wish I had something to add, but I agree with you. So back to the paper, which we just replicated and benchmarked. They ended their Summer Institute presentation by offering to give out the IP data to their friends. They said during the presentation, quote, "We have the data archived. We can talk about that offline," clearly implying that they're willing to share the data, the IP data, with their friends through back channels, so that their friends can look through anyone's IP address that they want. Let's hope they're not friends with the Chinese or Turkish governments. So after ending that talk by saying we have the data archived, let's talk about that offline, that talk was put on YouTube and then promptly deleted from YouTube and then re-uploaded on YouTube with the last few minutes cut off, where they make that offer to share that data. So it's like it never happened. And there's no proof of it happening unless you were there, or unless you archived the original YouTube video that was briefly up. I take that as a cover up and as an admission of guilt. They knew that it was wrong to offer to share the IP data with anyone who they're friends with. But that ending of the talk was super unethical, but that's not even how they intended to end the Summer Institute talk. They intended to end it in a much more unethical way. And the way they intended to end it was with this slide right here. They uploaded so the day before the Summer Institute talk, Florian uploaded these slides onto his GitHub repository because he thought that repository was private, but it was actually public. So this is why we can see it in a twist of irony. this slide was the last slide in what was supposed to be their presentation. And I believe that this was the grand reveal that drew the New York Times to the presentation, like the mic drop moment right at the end. And it's particularly a scumbag thing to do because he began the presentation by saying, "Nothing I do is a threat to anyone." And then he knew the whole time that he was planning to end the presentation by explicitly threatening someone specifically. And it's even worse than people realize, this thread, because if they went through EGMR to specifically try to find this one individual poster, then the odds are they went through EGMR, or it's highly possible that they went through EGMR to find other individual posters. For example, if you're Paul Goldsmith Pinkham, is the first thing you do with this data is the very first thing not who posted about your plagiarism on EGMR that resulted in that huge scandal. We have to trust him that he never even bothered to look at who posted that.
Can you explain this?
And when
I don't
confronted,
understand this.
yeah, go
Can you
ahead.
explain this slide? I don't understand how this is, what the slide means.
Oh, so when they presented at the National Bureau of Economic Research Summer Institute, they presented their summer statistics, they presented how the hack happened, they presented the toxicity, and then after the presentation, they ended it by saying, "Oh, sorry, this is probably why you don't understand it." That red bar there, I blocked it out because I don't want to give out anyone's IP address, but it had an IP address there. That was supposed to be the IP address of the owner of EGMR. So they actually are telling the world his IP address, which is, and it goes deeper than that. Like we'll get into more doxing that they did, but this was the first time they individually released the IP data for one specific person.
So what's under the red is a response to the Kirk post saying, "Here's your IP address. Where's my $1 million?" Basically. Okay. And
Right.
incidentally publicly revealing the IP address. Okay, thanks. I got the story now.
Yeah, and when they updated their paper this morning, they added the IP address to that paper. It wasn't there, and now it's there. So the IP, I believe, like I only read the paper a couple times this morning, but I believe the IP address in full is now in that paper. And so when they were confronted on Twitter about this doxing slide where they revealed the IP, Paul Goldsmith Pinkham claimed that it was an old version, so he took it out because it was an old version. You're looking at an old version. We took it out, that's fine. Except it was uploaded to GitHub one day before the presentation, so it wasn't really an old version. They were planning on ending their talk that way, and then once they received backlash and blowback, they took it out. Oh, yeah, perfect. And then after the grand reveal IP address on that final slide, Florian then repeatedly doxed the alleged owner of EJMR on Twitter, not only by IP address, but by name, contact information, and they even like harassed his mother. Like they went after this guy's mother and like tried to publicly shame her into shaming her son for allegedly owning EJMR, which is definitely not proven at all. I'm under the impression that they doxed the wrong person. There's a lot of proof that they doxed the wrong person or right person. They may or may not have. We don't know. But like Justin Wolfers, he doesn't care. He tweets it out to the world, to his hundreds of thousands of followers. Who is Kirk? Meet Kirk, the owner of EJMR. And that post contains Kirk's IP address, but also like all his contact information, personal information, name, who his mother is, like his mother's contact information. It was like that's about as doxy as you can get. And as you can see, Florian Ederer retweeted that post. So Florian Ederer might say we did not specifically dox anyone. We just put out an IP address. But then the whole time he's retweeting people who are doxing people using. If you read that post, who is Kirk, EJMR exposed, it'll say the reason we found out how to do this doxing of Kirk and find out who him and his mother allegedly are is that this paper was written and we used the methodology and data from this paper. And to top this all off, Politico then announced that Florian Ederer was the favorite to be the next European Union's chief economist for competition. On August 3rd, Politico wrote, for now, Ederer is the only known candidate. So if anyone knows anything about the European Union, you would know that they take data protection regulation much more seriously than they do in North America. So stealing millions of IP addresses via brute force hack, when they're clearly meant to be hidden as per the website's terms of service and linked to sensitive and confidential personal posts, quite blatantly, if you read the EU's general data protection regulation, it quite blatantly violates that GDPR. Therefore, I wrote an article saying rather than give him a job as being put in charge of competition on the continent, that the EU should give him a massive punitive fine or arrest him. To that end, I was planning to end this presentation by urging anyone listening to submit a complaint to the EU at these two links if you believe that Florian Ederer violated the General Data Protection Regulation. Yeah, I mean, like, if you found this explanation compelling and you think he violated the General Data Protection Regulation, those are the links to report him. And in addition to reporting him to the EU, because the FBI field office was the one who investigated the AT&T hack, which is very, very similar. Like, it's a very close precedent to this one. I am under the impression that the FBI is the law enforcement jurisdiction. If you believe this is a hack, then the FBI has the jurisdiction to investigate that hack. So those are the two links there to report this hack to the FBI. It's not actually, when you think of reporting to the FBI, you think FBI.tips.gov. But the appropriate place to report it is actually the Internet Crime Complaint Center, which is a part of the FBI, and the link is there. And then also there's a link to the New Haven FBI field office. And that's how I was planning to end the talk, right? But then yesterday, Florian Ederer, and the two others, I always say one, but I really should say all three of them. They released a paper on Twitter, an updated version of their paper, a hugely updated version. And he did it with this tweet here, so I don't have like a comprehensive, rigorous dismantling of their new paper, but I do have some important points to make and powerful points to make. First of all, it's super embarrassing that he was invited to present here today, and then rather than show up, he does like this weird ambush at the last minute. So I began this talk by comparing them to like high school children. It just feels very high school to me. Like he's trying to ambush this talk, and I don't know. I didn't really have to change any of my slides. Like, we'll talk about his slides, but it's just kind of embarrassing. And that was the consensus on EGMR as well. So there's a thread on the front page right now called Florian published new drafted paper one day before Carl presents. And yeah, I mean, if you go read that thread, people are just kind of laughing at him for like stooping so low to do such like a weird ambush. I'm not going to read these posts, but you can read them. Like, people are just kind of confused and like embarrassed for him and for the state of the profession. And now, okay, so there are some, like, I did not.
You put up the
Go ahead.
FBI thing, which I presume you have tipped the FBI off to this, but they can be sued as well, right? You were a little bit, oh, nothing legal will ever happen to them because the government will never do anything, which may or may not be true. Government takes its sweet time, but they could also be sued by private parties.
Definitely. And I think so I'm a little bit hesitant to comment on that because, well, like, I'm not afraid of like calling for lawsuits. Like, I believe totally they should be sued, but I don't know who has damages, who can sue for what. Like, I don't know. That's a whole thing. But
I don't see any lawyers in our on my list of faces on Zoom. But if we have one, it would be interesting to hear some commentary on to what extent there are legal remedies here. But please go ahead.
Sure. So I read the paper for the first time this morning, and there are a couple key takeaways. The number one major update I saw was that they added a frequently asked questions to the appendix of the paper where they said, is this a hack? No, it's not a hack. and my interpretation of this is that the correct place to debate whether or not it's legally a hack is not in the appendix of a paper, it's in court in front of a judge. That's really the person who should be responsible for determining whether or not this is a hack. And people can make up their own mind on whether or not they believe it's a hack. Like there's a lot of legal definitions of hack, but I don't know. I'm going to go out on a limb here and think most people listening to this presentation right now probably believe that this was a hack. And that's my conclusion, definitely. So that's one update. But the second major update in the paper, there are many like new figures and stuff, but this is the main new figure that I'm going to talk about, which is the cumulative distribution of toxicity classifier by subreddit. So Florian, what he did, or the Yale authors, what they did is they found out that Econ Job Rumors was comparing their data to Reddit. And so without giving any credit whatsoever to Econ Job Rumors, who were the first ones, or even the Twitter guy, like the guy who pointed on Twitter is really the first one who compared it to Reddit, that he should have got credit, but they took the credit for themselves and they compared EGMR's toxicity. You can see that bar in the middle there, that's 10% toxic. And they compare that toxicity to 1,000, I forget if it's 1,000 or 10,000 off the top of my head, subreddits. I think it's 1,000. And they conclude that EGMR is more toxic than 73% of subreddits. So that's really their main new finding, that EGMR, when you compare it to toxic to Reddit, is still extremely toxic. So if you compare that to my finding though, so remember I had 22 subreddits, and 7 of those 22 subreddits, which is about 30%, were less than 10% toxic. So that's 30% of my sample was less than 10% toxic. So if you were to redraw this cumulative distribution using my Reddit data, which is not 1,000 subreddits, it's 22 subreddits, the black line would go through the red line on the bottom. So it's really a question now of whether you find his results more plausible or my results more plausible. And so I'm not really, I think the best way to talk about his results is by the people who have posted about it on EGMR in this thread. So if you go read that Florian publishes new drafted paper thread, there's tons of comments like discussing how he could have manipulated his subreddit data to make it seem like EGMR was less toxic than Reddit. And these, like, I mean, I think they're great. The general consensus in that thread is that his data was extremely p-hacked and manipulated, but that's hard to prove because I've only read it a couple times this morning. But that is the consensus on EGMR, at least. There's a ton of these threads. They all make better points than me. Someone has their hand up. Go for it. You're muted, though.
Yeah, let me just say this. A lot of the presentation you're making, I'm not sure you would make if you really understood how the economics profession works and how the peer review process works and how the academic debate works. And
Sure.
so my first piece of advice to you is if you can sit down with an economist who knows these things, you could be far more influential amongst economists. I'm not sure about the rest of the world. That said, let me just point out something where I think where your point is strongest. Okay, first of all, I find Economic Job Rumors an awful place, and I never go there. But I'm a free speech person. Everybody has the right to set up any website they want. But I think you have an even stronger argument than that. The peer review process is by definition an anonymous process. And so for economists to simply say an anonymous process, it is fine. And in a peer review process, if somebody hacked a journal to reveal who the referees were, we would be absolutely appalled. And it seems to me your strongest argument is exactly on those lines. There are many different ways of peer review, right? And this is one of them, whether we like it or not. And the same guarantees of anonymity that apply to referees should apply in this case.
I agree with you. Is there a question?
I'm just saying that's really what you should focus on. You know, as John said, when you ascribing intent, terror, always bad. But in particular, in this case, there are many times you're ascribing intent that you never get to come, because it's pretty typical in the economics profession to do some of the stuff that they do.
Yeah, whether we are or not toxic by some completely arbitrary toxic measure, I think is less important than just the act of having revealed the IP addresses. I've got Josh, then David, and then Richard.
Well, that actually, John, that was kind of the exact point I was going to make. I mean, I think, and thanks, Chris, for that very interesting presentation. You know, I just think there are two separate issues here. One is, you know, they've done this study. Let's separate out the fact that the study actually, for a moment, that the study actually teaches people how to geolocate and perhaps also dox. But they've written a study that analyzes posts based on their geolocation and assesses their toxicity. And you've presented a lot of stuff about kind of whether those results are valid or not. I actually don't find the question very interesting, because you've explained to us why it's not interesting, because this definition of toxic is basically completely bogus. And also, what is toxic speech? It's a totally subjective thing. You know, we're free speakers here, so you know we tend to care less about these types of issues generally. And so, you know, yeah, is EJMR at the 30th percentile of toxicity or the 75th percentile of toxicity based on this person's definition of toxic or some other definition of toxic? That's fine, and that's sort of engaging with the paper on its own terms. I think the really very powerful part, though, is the aspect of these people use university resources and the NBER platform to present a paper that teaches people how to geolocate and perhaps also dox. It doesn't, in the paper itself, I don't think it is revealing, they would say this is not revealing the identity of any given person, but it is actually, you know, it is teaching people how to do so, and taking a user, you know, 90% of the way there, and it possibly does so through illegal hacking activity. All of this somehow got through the board of the Yale IRB. Anybody here who's got experience dealing with IRBs, I mean, you know, I've been held up on IRBs for all kinds of projects that are completely harmless. So I guess my sort of a comment is, I think I would just make it very clear that your work, there's these kind of two different aspects of it. One is sort of taking the paper on its own terms. Is the paper even correct? Is it asking a good question? Is it, you know, assessing the paper on its own terms? The other is, this paper actually might very well be doing things that are both unethical and illegal, and it's a scandal that university resources were used for it.
And advertising that the data is available to their friends, even worse. Yes. I think I got David next.
Yeah, excellent paper. I noticed you're a fellow Canadian.
Yeah.
So I want to just emphasize what Jonathan Burke said, but also add that, remember, this isn't like revealing the referees of journals. Like, if I say this article is crap and it should be rejected, I'm not going to go to a concentration camp. Whereas, as you pointed out, I think this should be one of your main emphases. These people have their lives at risk in many cases. And that, I think you should make Jonathan's point, but then add that that's way bigger a deal.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. Well, the thing about it is it's hard to make every single point in one presentation.
Yeah.
Like I may have bit off more than I can chew by like talking about toxicity and then talking about the legal issues, but I did my best to cover everything.
No, wait,
Yeah, I would just say that I think that probably I would say don't even talk about toxicity.
You haven't actually had a question yet, which is fine. That's the way it usually goes here. Man.
Yeah, great talk, Chris. I really loved the talk and all the hard work you've put into this. So thanks. It's really service to the profession. And I also want to push back on a few comments here that the toxicity is not important. I mean, that may be true in this crowd, but I think many people that defended, these authors and what they've done, they come to this and saying, "Oh, EGMR is, such a bad place, and look at all the bad things that are said, and it's very toxic." And so, yeah, there may be some consequence in what these guys have done, but we need to take it down. And Florian and that crew, they're doing the service of the profession. So putting that into context and pushing back on that, I thought was actually very helpful personally, and I think it's important to get that out there. It's true that the overall emphasis finally, right, but with that toxicity out of the way, no one can make that more strongly, that the overall emphasis on, they did something that is probably illegal. It probably was a hack. I found that very compelling. I have one question, though, and I think it still probably is on the minds of many that posted on EJMR. How far can you go from these IP addresses to identify, individuals? And I mean, they don't want to do this in their study, I understand, but how easy would it be? Do you think people have done it? And how much should people that wrote some of the whatever toxic posts wrote, how much do they have to fear, and by whom? And do you have any sense of that? That would be, I'm kind of curious about that.
Well, I'm going to answer a slightly different question. When I worked at Statistics Canada, I worked in the microdata access division, which gave out confidential microdata. And whenever economists in the research data centers were running any sort of tabulations or whatever on any of the data, they had strict rules on what the sample sizes could be or what they could release in terms of sample size. Because let's say like there's one person in Nunavut who makes $100,000, like you can probably find out who that is if you release that person, and you can see like all their data if you just assume like that one person in Nunavut who makes $100,000 or $1 million, I don't know. You can see like where they live, like all their health data, all their data. And so the reason why I bring that up is because in the updated version of the paper, if you look at the summary statistics, like they're giving statistics on like tiny schools with like one or two economics professors at sometimes. So they have the IP addresses of, let's say, first of all, you would need sorry, just give me a second. Yeah, so tiny schools. There's one professor posting on that same IP address, and he's posting identifying information for years on end from the same IP address, although that's not the IP address is signal sometimes. But the question to answer, I guess, is the way to identify that one professor is if he posted identifying information about himself anonymously on that IP address, the authors would have to do a detective work pretty much to like figure out what he said about himself, what he said about his colleagues. But if there's one professor at the college and he's like posting nonstop about finance and or like a certain subfield of finance and like that's his subfield, you can pretty much find out who he is. So the answer to your question is that it depends on what you post. Like you would have had to kind of posted information that can lead back to you.
I think, Chris,
that would be the main way.
It's easier if you're the Chinese government, because then you can put together not just EGMR, but you're watching your Amazon account, your credit card, God knows what else they've hacked.
Yeah.
And then connecting, you wrote this about the Uyghurs, is much easier for them. I think Dan is next.
Yeah.
Hi, great presentation, Chris. My drift is like Harold's really, about so-called toxicity, and it's kind of a comment, not really a question. It's that I think the most important part of your toxicity, discussion isn't so much the comparisons that result, the empirical comparisons that come out of it, but the looking under the hood of this so-called toxicity algorithm, and talking about the semantics of the word toxicity, because that utilization of language on the part of the leftist activists and, you know, the Yale guys and so on, that's really like so important, and it's so parallel to the abuse of language, like you mentioned, with mis and disinformation and with hate crimes and so on. So it's actually the kind of the getting under the hood and the conceptual contemplation of that semantic that I think is most important, and then naturally it makes sense, I think, to follow through and do the kind of comparison you do. Let me also say that, you know, I wonder if there might be some way to somehow make an algorithm about scorn, which I think is a much better word. It's more like just like the violence, which could be violence in a boxing ring, which is perfectly proper. Some scorn is perfectly proper, and just sort of do a scorn algorithm that somehow gets the ideological element either out of it or somehow neutral, and do a comparison then of that algorithm with the one that they use. Thanks.
Yeah, well, creating that algorithm would be like a whole PhD project. So, well, like that's like a computer, like this toxicity algorithm was made by, I don't know, like 5 researchers from like Carnegie Mellon and Microsoft. It was a lot of Microsoft people. So I'm a little bit hesitant to try to make my own scorn algorithm, especially with machine learning. Like I'd have to teach myself like machine learning all over again. And I don't know, like if there's one out there that would be better than Toxygen, like in fact, it would be good to compare different, like maybe like there are several algorithms that can quantify toxicity, right? Like Twitter's in-house, or Twitter did it themselves using an algorithm that was not Toxygen Alberta, right? They did a different toxicity algorithm, but they got a comparable score. So one thing I would be interested in doing, which is also a whole other project, is like to comprehensively run, I don't know, like 10 different toxicity algorithms on the EGMR data and see how robust those results are.
Maybe
I forget if I answered your question, but
maybe the classical liberalism initiative needs to come up with the classical liberalism indicator of toxicity. That would be a lot of fun. Or the free speech indicator of toxicity, which will once every 10 years say something is toxic. Are there any other questions?
I see 8 chats in the chat. Sorry, I haven't looked at any of the chat, but those are from.
Do any of the
Okay,
chatters
don't
want
worry.
to say something in public?
Well, I just, Chris, check that I said something to you and then I realized you were talking about that guy, not about yourself. I said that I'm glad you didn't commit suicide. But anyway, that was my little mistake. But I am glad you're alive.
With that, thank you
Yeah,
very
well,
much. Sorry.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you very
Oh
much,
no,
Chris.
I was just saying.
It was very interesting. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and we will see you whenever the next one of these is, which I should know, but I forgot to look it up. So, bye, everybody.
Thanks. Bye. Good talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chris, can you hang out a minute?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I'll be here.
So I just want to ask you, like, where'd you grow up in Canada?
I'll leave mine on just in case. I think mine
Okay.
might turn you
Yeah,
off.
sure. I mean,
So go for it.
I'm
but
happy to
see you
talk
later.
about Canada. I grew up in Ottawa, Ontario.
Oh, okay.
So like
Okay.
I grew up in Ottawa. I went to Carleton, and then I did my master's in financial economics at Western,
Okay.
and then I worked for Statistics Canada. So like
Yeah.
I grew up in Ottawa,